All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome. It's a snowy day out here in Michigan in February, coming into Valentine's Day. But we are so delighted to have you all here with us for our second session of our volunteer management basic series. And today we're going to be talking about interview tips for great placements. And I have to, in full disclosure, I got these two sessions mixed up. It was supposed to be the recruitment. I'll put the recruitment next week. That was my bad. But I'm glad that you're here. So many of you are here. We had a great session last week. I sent out yesterday the follow-up documents that kind of help with the onboarding and things like that. So with that, I am going to go ahead and get started. My name is Melissa Sherry, and I am the Volunteer Impact Coordinator for the Michigan Community Service Commission. And the Michigan Community Service exists to be able to support nonprofits with volunteer needs. And this is one of the things that we do to help build your capacity to utilize amazing volunteers in our state is by providing volunteer management and nonprofit effectiveness training. So with that, this is part of our volunteer management basic series, and we are just glad to have you with us. So let's just jump right in. We had a grant called the Volunteer Generation Fund. And even though we don't have a grant now, I always mention it because it's so important. It's really about telling the story about volunteerism in our state. It's about building the capacity of nonprofits to utilize volunteers. And one of the strategies that we utilized to do this was through trainings and then reaching out and documenting with data and asking you, our partners, to share your data. Nothing that would like violate any privacy concerns. But if I ask, just keep in mind, I might ask you at some point this year to provide your volunteer hours and your volunteer numbers. And then if you did happen to have like some information on young people who volunteer in your organization, we'd love to have that too. But that really all it does is it helps us tell that story about who's volunteering, what's important to them, where are they volunteering. But hopefully that you'll be in a position to share that information if we ask. So let's talk about our objectives today. So one of the things that I think is really important as we're talking about our interviews and the placements is that the interview leads to a great placement if it's done right. So the importance of an interview and the placement process, like how do you do it? We're going to talk about developing your own process. We're going to talk about some strategies for great interviews and some really solid placement practices. I try to tend not to say best practices because we recognize that every nonprofit here is very, very different. And most of the nonprofits are sometimes volunteer run or they have a skeleton staff, and it's things may or may not be possible for you to implement. So when you go through any of our trainings, whether it's the basic series or one of our other ones, always keep that lens in mind that we're not telling you this is what you have to do. We're telling you these are some really sound practices, and what you can even grow into would be a great thing to do. So, what are your needs and challenges? A lot of times, your needs of your organization and the challenges that your organization has will dictate kind of what some of those needs and answers need to come from an interview. For example, uh, there may be times when you're looking to fill gaps in what your where your volunteers are available. Let's say, Tuesday from 5 to 7 is your biggest gap, and you just absolutely need to get that filled. That may be something that takes precedence in your interview, and it's not filling with a warm body, but it's keeping that in mind that you need to be able to fill the needs. It's great to have volunteers, but if they're not filling the needs that you have, then you have a challenge. But we'll talk more about that. And so what do you need to accomplish with an interview? Well, one of the most interesting things is and that I think I've struggled with this. I every volunteer interviewer I've ever worked with has struggled with this. We do the talking and we don't listen enough. And I don't mean to say that as a blanket thing that you don't listen. I'm not saying that. But what you're trying to accomplish in an interview is to make sure that this person is a good fit. Because I bet you that if when you have a bad placement, it creates more work for you. It creates more work for the program team and the others that are supporting the volunteers, and it creates problems for volunteers as well. So, the things can be a number of things. It doesn't mean that you have a bad apple, but the person isn't able to meet the demands of the position. So, one thing is I was kind of reflecting on the session last week that I didn't say is that one of the things that in the interview that you should always ask when you present that position description, and we talked about position descriptions last week, is that if you give them time to process it, you talk to them through it, and then you say, now, is there any reason why, after reviewing this position description and learning about the role, that you would not be able to fulfill the requirements of the position? And that right there is a really important interview question to ask because, first of all, it's their moment to say, I might have a problem, or two, there might be something that's maybe not obvious. It could be a disability. We talked about disabilities last time. And if you didn't join us, I love working with individuals who are living with a disability. I've found that we've had great success in being able to incorporate them into our programs, but it's really about a partnership. So maybe at that point, that's a good opportunity, and it's an aha moment where you make sure that you don't put somebody in a position where it's going to cause some of those other problems I just talked about with a bad placement. And so it's really a thing of respect to the person, and then it's really respect for your program as well, that you care so much about this volunteer to be able to make sure it's a successful placement and that they have the skills that they need. So asking what that is. And then also, I talked about this having like the physical requirements of the position. So for example, one of the things I pretty sure I mentioned was um, pushing a wheelchair that with, 200 pounds of weight unassisted. And, wheelchairs have changed over time. Maybe that's different now, but um, that would always be like a trigger. Like if you're in a food bank, to be able to pick a box up with 25 pounds of food or 50 pounds of food or whatever it is, to be able to have that hard and fast, this is what you absolutely have to do because you can't put somebody in that position who, unfortunately has a back injury and can't do this. And so being clear about those things. So that's one thing. Can they meet the requirements of the position? Now, I know many of our roles, they are roles that we provide the training. At least I think that's for the most part, for most frontline volunteers, we provide the training. They may need some basic things, like they might need to be able to know how to answer a phone or to be able to hear clearly on the phone. They may need to be able to walk a certain distance. They could do that with or without an accommodation. And then, is it in a reasonable accommodation that you could help with? We had one, and I think I told you about this. Somebody, it wasn't English as a first language, and the phone call would come in and it would be hurried and it would be fast. He'd get nervous. He wouldn't get it. And and it was creating problems. Not that this wasn't a great person, but that was just it was a bad placement. We probably shouldn't have put him there. I could imagine if I were in his shoes, I don't even really I'm not competent in another language, but I would feel the same way. So understand, um, how that can work. So the other things that you need to be able to accomplish in an interview, so on a larger scale, not even just, can you lift that 25 pounds? What's even more critical in that interview, is this person a good fit for your organization? Uh, do you think that they could pose a risk to the organization? Do you think that they could pose, any other kind of problem for the organization? And then, is there anything that you're observing in terms of red flags that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes? So you want to know, are they someone who is going to be able to add to your organization and really be able to support the mission of what you're doing? Or do they, perhaps even have an ulterior motive? So you're looking for fit. And it doesn't mean that someone isn't a good fit, that you, one, shouldn't try them, or two, that you're just like, that's it, that we're done. One of the things that I always made sure that we did is that we never let anybody go away empty-handed. So even if we couldn't accommodate them here in our organization, I would always make sure to do a referral somewhere else and give them some coaching points about where might be a good fit. And you probably know your community partners. So it's something in an interview that I would always be cognizant of. And, even asking, would you like me to make a call and, do an introduction? I think that shows a lot of respect for that person. And it supports volunteers overall in your community and still leaves them with a great impression of your organization, that you cared about them. So, here's a question. How are you structuring interviews? Is it one-on-one? Is it in a group? Who's doing your interviews? Who's, how much time are you spending in the interviews? And then what happens after the interview? Are there clear directions on next steps? Are you pulling that person through that process? These are all things that I think we need to talk about today, in terms of that interviewing and that placement. So, oh, did I go back, or no, I'm sorry, I didn't even go forward. So the interview. So as I said, here's a few things. The fit for the culture and the values. We would start out our interviews with a disclaimer, and it was kind of in a group, and we would say, um, uh, here at our organization, we're looking for potential volunteers who will be a great fit for our organization and fit into our culture of delivering excellent care, blah, 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 whatever the mission was. And so not all volunteers go through the interview process and end up being accepted. And if that doesn't happen, here's what's going to happen. We will find you, we will help you, we'll work with you to find another place to volunteer, because we really do care about people volunteering. We care about this community. We know the impact of volunteers. But if we're not a good fit for you for whatever reason, we'll help you find another place. And the fact that somebody wasn't a good fit doesn't mean that they're a bad person again, but it could be that when they're available, is not a good time for us. They have some external needs. They're looking for employment, for example. I mean, these are all very common things, and that they would be things that we would come up against. So, and then the next thing is exploring the volunteers' motivations. Why do they want to volunteer? I always ask that question after they, tell us a little bit about themselves. We use something, an introduction tool called Aid It, and they had heard about this before they came to the interview. But in this, we introduce ourselves, we acknowledge them, we introduce ourselves, we tell them what's going to happen that day, and give them the information that they need so they could understand and process. So we'd even tell them, you're going to be here for an hour today. Um, and this is what's going to happen. We'll walk you through everything. And we really appreciate the fact that you're here. So then each volunteer would tell us a little bit about themselves. And then we would ask, so why this organization? Why now? And what are you hoping to get out of this? And just really asking that question, I think, is very powerful in terms of a couple things. One, listen to what they're saying. Listen really closely because sometimes they tell you what you need to know. You just may not recognize it. Um, I would also say the interview is the first step in launching a good relationship with them. And we were really honest that we would say, you know what, we want to have a long term relationship with you. We have volunteers who've been in our organization for 50 years. Someday, it may not be me, but someday I would hope that we were going to give you a 50-year award. Sometimes that's, not appropriate because they're not going to be alive. Neither would I at 50, but in 50 years from now, or maybe I will. Hopefully, I'm not working when I'm 102. But so to understand that I hope that I'm here in 5 years. I hope that we're both here in 5 years that I can give you an award, or something like that. So, start setting that foundation for the fact that it's going to be a long-term relationship. And then asking them, how long would you like to volunteer with us? How long would you like to serve? And sometimes they're going to say, well, I'm only in the area for another year. And this gives you an opportunity to think beyond here and now and right here and say, you know what? We have opportunities where you can help us in a virtual setting. You'll maybe have to work on those, but you know, we still can have a relationship with you. So then understanding what the volunteers' commitments are. Like I've got a little guy running around here today because it's a snow day. I can tell you 9 times out of 10, family commitments are always going to trump your volunteer commitments. And we as people in this, we understand that. But to really understand what that is, some of them are ones that can be worked around, some of them can be. So understand what those are. And I have some tips on the things that you cannot ask about, FYI, later on. And then it's also a screening tool. Listen to your instincts, listen to your intuition. I've unfortunately had to I literally interviewed thousands of potential volunteers. And I've had interviewees that didn't plan on telling me about a criminal background. Believe it or not, I did have one that was in for the big M word. He had gotten out, I think it was an attempted, by the way. But he had gotten out of prison and he, wanted to volunteer. I had some that have done other things that really just I could never put them in with any kind of a vulnerable person or have good feelings about referring them to another organization. So listen and then dig in a little more, and I'm going to give you some tips on that. And the last thing is about setting expectations. Setting expectations like, what does it mean to be a volunteer in our organization? How do we act? How do we treat each other? Those things should be layered in and they should see those. And like, how do we do stuff around here? If your organization is like, how are decisions made? How is communication done? Talk about those kind of things and be really upfront and honest about what your challenges are in terms of, how volunteers are helping to meet our challenges. I think those are all good things to set expectations for in the interview. And then here is a great recipe for an exceptional interview. I love recipes. I've just started making sourdough bread, and I have to follow the recipe every single time. So even though I've made several loaves now, I still have to go back and look at it. So this is always a good idea, even if you feel like we're doing great in our interviews, take a look at this. Perfect your opening of the interview. Like I said, that we had that statement like this, that disclaimer that said, you may not be accepted as a volunteer, but we're going to help you find another great place. We also, in that we were saying, we have behavior standards. We have standards for people who their needs, their availability are in good alignment. We're not going to just take a warm body. And that doesn't mean that we're creating barriers or exclusions, but we care about our volunteers so much that even if you could volunteer here, but we know it's not going to be a great experience for either one of us, it would be better for you to be in another place. And that's hard when we're trying to rebuild our volunteer programs, but for the good of the program and the good of that experience for a volunteer, it's always best to do this way. And this is after literally thousands of those interviews and helping thousands of people find great places to volunteer and dealing with lots of issues when that didn't happen. So, really listening for those motivations of why someone's seeking a volunteer work. Again, after all those interviews I've done, it kind of will go into a couple of different things. One, I've had people who have had motivations that were way out in left field and were not going to fit. I had a person one time in a healthcare setting. I want to make sure I save every soul. Huh, okay. Well, I mean, I'm a person of faith, but there's an appropriate time and a place. And in healthcare, we can't proselytize to people, but maybe in another setting that would be appropriate. It just wasn't appropriate in ours. So think about that and think about, how do you work with people and how do you um, set the expectations where something is okay and something isn't okay. You're looking for their skills and their work habits. We would actually ask things like, do you prefer to work alone or do you want to work in a group? Do you want to be in front of people or do you want to be behind the scenes? All these things are good. There's no right or wrong answer, but it gives you a good idea about what to be aware of in terms.
Melissa? Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. We just had a question about the person that was released from prison.
oh,
They're wondering how to navigate that. They said, I
yeah.
believe people who have served their time and want to volunteer, I would have a hard time turning them away.
Oh, okay.
Are there rules around that?
It really depends on your organizational stance and your organizational rules. So this is a great question to talk with your HR team about, talk to your legal team about, talk to your leadership, even your board perhaps. Where I was in that particular setting was this individual, it was not in healthcare. I was actually running a volunteer center. I'll tell you the whole thing. I was running a volunteer center, and this man called and said that he really would like to work with young people. And I was like, oh, okay. And so tell me more about that. And he wanted to be able to mentor them. Okay. And so as we started talking, there was something that it triggered, and I had asked him about, his employment, where did he work, where, what, has he done this before? Things like that. And then that's how it came out. And you know, I ended up talking with my leader, my direct leader, and truthfully, what this person wanted to do, at least at the time, I did not have an opportunity for him to do that with youth because of that conviction. Now, keep in mind, this was close to 20 years ago now. In some ways, the the view has changed on that. I would even say as a wider as a wider society and nonprofit in this work, the view of people who have been previously incarcerated has changed. I'm not making a statement as to whether how I feel about it or whatever, but I'm usually guided by the organizational rules. And so what are some things that you cannot um serve for? Like with AmeriCorps, that kind of conviction would preclude you from serving in AmeriCorps. Being on the sex offender list would preclude you from serving in AmeriCorps. I don't know about attempted. I think that would be something that would get worked through with the organization the same way this decision was, to be quite honest. We would talk about fitness and whether, in this case, um, I would have been referring them out to another organization, and I couldn't in good faith um let that person go out with, at least without them on someone understanding what the background was. That being said, I believe that we did find an opportunity for him in a very structured environment that was not doing that. But I think that to some it led to some skill building, if I recall. So even that, I would say, I remember that one specifically because it was something totally different that he did, but it worked out. It was in a good place. The organization was well aware, and that was in a referral. Keep in mind that the background is not a private thing, it's public. You can tell another organization, hey, there was a background, you may want to talk to this person about this. You go through your screening protocols. We were unable to place him here, but this might be something you want to do. And I would always coach the person when and we're going to talk about this later, when I would say, I'm sorry, we have to decline you. Um, I would always talk to them about being upfront about that, as if they already were, or maybe we found it in the background check, I would coach them on that for the next time. Does that help? I will tell you, I also had a sex offender one, and it was in healthcare, and absolutely positively healthcare is very, very stringent on our and not just the hospital's view, but the as a whole, like your accreditation body for Medicare and Medicaid. Um, this would be somebody you can't put in touch with vulnerable adults. And um eh, we had, I'll give you later the scripting that was used, but long story short, your job is also to make sure that people are safe. And if you have a doubt whether someone could do this job for whatever reason, um, you think about this. Is this somebody that you would put with your elderly parent or your elderly grandmother to provide care for her or him? And if it isn't, then that's your answer. You're there to protect the organization, not to protect the volunteer. The volunteer is there to protect the volunteer's feelings about it. You have a specific job you have to do. Does that help? I don't know whose that was, but if you want to put in the chat or whatever.
We had
That
just
that
had
does,
one more question about
yeah,
that. Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that does help. I guess so. My I don't know if you have something about this in the slides, but is there a way to make sure that you're not having bias come into play with these volunteer interviews? Because I mean, we all know on this call, right? Like racism, sexism exists, right? And so we have those internal biases and unconscious biases. So I guess I would push back a little bit on what you said about like what I feel comfortable having them be with my elderly parent. Well, you might have some unconscious biases that are getting in your way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I guess it's just something to think about. when with volunteer, and I'm curious if you have some best practices with that.
I do. And, here's what I would say about that. Um, okay, so I have also had the issue of this is kind of more common that I would have ever expected that I would have dealt with, but people who had a change in status or m- impacted by medications and their abilities. Uh, I'm going to give you that example, and then I'm not talking about like well, okay, let's talk about a bias. Somebody who had a tattoo on their face. That was one that I know we had a picture of a lady with this tattoo on her face, and our it was in our in the training for this. And what would you do with this person? What do you think of this person? And it was kind of unbelievable what people thought. And I'm going to, in full disclosure, and I think this is really goofy. This is really silly of me now, but, please, no offense to anyone, but I used to have a bias about people with tattoos. And you think about it, and I'm 52 years old. You think about how many people have tattoos now. And it was, I think, at one point an unconscious bias. And then I took some training and I realized, oh, I think I have a bias about this. Not even just about their face, anywhere on their body. Now I think it's terribly silly because I think 90% of the people I know have a tattoo somewhere. And I mean, it never changed how I felt about them. And then so now I look back and I think that's really kind of a silly bias, and I'm aware of it and I can put it aside. We would actually do a lot of training with our interviewers and our volunteers on conscious and unconscious bias. And it was interesting because the understand that I still would say you have to be careful of protecting your organization. I will give you another example. I had a guy come in for an interview. I mean, he looked fine and everything like that, but all of a sudden, like in his conversations with me, he was like kind of argumentative. And I remember feeling like, ah, uh, like kind of like, "Oh, why is he arguing with me?" And then he went in and he met with the interviewer, and the interviewer just thought he was great, and she placed him. And then he got in and everything was okay at first, kind of, but every once in a while, I just thought maybe it was me that maybe for some reason, in some weird way, I don't like this person. I don't know. I mean, and I thought, well, I guess I don't know. I mean, maybe it's me. Maybe nobody else sees this. And so then I got a complaint. And I talked to the guy about it, and it was like, okay, like we need to talk about our mission, vision, and values. And then when you have those mission, vision, and values, and the volunteers have really described they're closest to the work, what do the behaviors look like that are closest to that? You have something to go on, and you have your organizational values and behavior standards. So it becomes less about you thinking something's one way or the other. Well, he had this guy had a wheelchair that he happened to like. And he goes up to take somebody out, and they have the person in the wheelchair in another wheelchair because the person is large. And he says to the nurse, well, you better move him into my chair because I'm not leaving my chair with you. And the nurse says, well, oh, well, we'd like you to take this chair. We've got him settled. And he goes, I don't care how fat that guy is. I want my chair and I'm not leaving my chair up here. So move him over. And it was all in front of the patient. And it was one of those moments where I think back about, and I'm just being really clear, this is what he said. And it was a clear violation of our values. But you know what? my bad was that I didn't lean on that in the beginning and say, you know what? I think we're gonna handle this with a little more kid gloves. Would I have told him no from the beginning? Probably not. But would I have put him somewhere where it was more forward facing until, customer facing until I was comfortable that maybe my hunch wasn't right? That's what I should have done. So, think about that. But I've also had it where I gave somebody a chance and against my better judgment, and I really wish I had listened to my intuition. So, my other thing would say, if you have a hunch about somebody, I would say, um, I would say, have somebody else interview them and just do this on a trial basis. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't take someone unless there's a clear violation or conflict with your organizational direction. But if you're worried about putting somebody, if it's a safety issue and you're worried about putting somebody in contact with someone else because of that, I would say, you probably need to reevaluate here and make sure you have good guidance and people that you can talk to about it. So I'm gonna move on from there, but there's more on this, as we go on. And then closing the interview is all about you're setting the expectation for what's gonna happen next. What's gonna happen when they get started, their training, even like where they're gonna put their coat, who they're gonna meet when they get there. So it's all the information that they need to feel comfortable showing up that first day, even where they're gonna park. Those are the little things that you'd be surprised. We're thinking big picture and they're thinking, where am I going to put my coat? Where am I going to go to the bathroom? Where am I going to park my car? Is it going to be safe? Am I going to be safe? Who's going to meet me? They need the little things. So having that and then even having like that reassurance of, I know that we talked about a lot today. This will be in our checklist, which is going to get emailed to you. It's always a great way to just kind of like let them be relaxed. So, oh my gosh. Okay. So, I said that there were some questions we should stay away from. And a volunteer interview is much the same way as an employment interview. It's always fine if a volunteer wants to share information and you really want them to be comfortable enough to share the information, but you can't ask. Are you married? They may say, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. Well, I've been married for 50 years and I have 4 children. So don't ask how many children they have or do they have children. I know this is straightforward, but what is your sexual orientation? Uh, what's your gender? What's your age? Do you have a disability? Now, I want to do a caveat on that, and I talked about that before, but I'm gonna go back to it. Are you a US citizen or what country were you born in? I would stay away from those. There is a way to ask that question specifically about are you eligible to work in the United States? And some organizations, that is something that you need to be concerned about. I haven't worked in an organization where I needed to make sure that somebody had a visa. Um, and I will, in full disclosure, tell you I'm not the expert at that. But if I ever had any question or concern about that, I would go to my HR partners who were really more um, um, aware of what those specific laws are. And then age and capacity related questions. Just because someone doesn't speak our language as well as maybe you or I do, doesn't mean that they can't, function in an appropriate way in our organization. We had lots of people who English was not a first language. We had lots of people with disabilities. Just because they have something or they're older doesn't mean they can't do something. But that goes back to the position description of giving them that opportunity. Now that you've seen the requirements of the position, is there any reason that you would not be able to do this role? Or do you have any questions or do you have any concerns about being able to do this? I would ask that question of anybody, and I would ask it across the board, not just because I thought somebody had something that may or may not. There's things, like I said, like with medications. Um, I've had people that were great in an interview and then they were in a position and, oh my gosh, we got to go back and talk about this. And, they would say, well, I'm on a medication. And I'm, oh, okay. Well, maybe right now is not the good time for you to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Um, you know, people's capabilities change over time. And that's why it's always a good idea to even like reassess, kind of renegotiate, re-recruit people because they may or may not see it. I worked with an older population and dementia was something that, really was a real thing that we dealt with. And when we did, we usually worked with the families. Um, I'm not saying that usually what would happen is I would have somebody who's got to that point. They weren't coming in necessarily with that. But sometimes, you know what? We had people that did come in and say, I have the early stages of dementia. Okay, let's talk about what that would mean for you. And what kind of things are you finding that you're having a challenge with? They open the door and it's really just about talking with them about it and saying, I mean, one, does it cause a safety problem? In lots of places it doesn't. It's not a big deal. They have a family member that's going to be there to support them and, like, and to ask, well, what if it gets to the point that it's not working out? How are you going to feel about that? Usually my experience is they're being forthright about it or their family members forthright about it. And if it's something that we can make happen, let's try it out. And I mean, let's just have good communication with each other. The same I would do with any volunteer. And so, if it's not going to cause a safety issue or a liability for the organization, maybe it's just fine. So, and you know what your positions are, but sometimes we would have lots of different things people could do. And sometimes it just had to be things that they could do for home for us. And that was fine too. Let's see. Why is this happening? Okay, so here are some of the red flags. And these, it doesn't mean that any single one of these is an issue, but there are things that make you go, and then I got to dig into that a little more. And if you're doing a group interview, I wouldn't dig into this more with somebody in front of a lot of people. But if you're getting these kind of like, you may need to, what we would do in a group interview is we would say, you know what, our policy was we weren't going to place anyone, and then those that were fine, we'd call them later. But the ones that we needed to talk to a little more or get a little more feedback from them, or maybe have someone else weigh in on it and meet with them, what we would do is we would have another time that we met with them. So the first thing is eye contact. Are they able to talk with you? Now, and I'm going to say this, that every single one of our teen volunteers, this was always so funny to me, but very rarely did I have like a perfect teen that would be able to communicate like an older adult would be able to. They just don't have those life experiences. So them not being able to have great eye contact at first was very common. And believe me, it would almost all the time you'd see a teen walking down the hall like this, and you knew that they were new, you knew that they were not comfortable. And then after they were there and we engaged with them, and they'd always seem to blossom, then they'd walk around with their heads up, so not having eye contact in that respect, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be a good volunteer. But look at that. Are they able to, look you in the eye? If they're not somebody who has that comfort level, you're not going to want to put them in a forward front, in audience place. And so just kind of look at that and say, is this someone who is going to be comfortable in that kind of role? Are they going to be someone who's forward enough to be able to go out talk to a client, or, you want to place them for success. The next thing is pregnant pauses in responses. That actually, with that person that I talked about before that had a prison term, that was, I think, one of the things, and it was over the phone, and he was like, it was those pregnant pauses, and I thought, "Oh, I gotta go back to that." And then communication skills. I mean, how are they communicating? Are you at ease with them? And is there anything that you feel like they're trying to get out of this? I've had, again, it doesn't mean that it's a red flag, but if you're trying to create a long-term relationship with someone and they have an ulterior motive, then you want to know. And I don't mean that ulterior motives are all bad. I've had people, and this goes back to like to 2008, particularly is when I'm really thinking that this came into my mind. We had people that were out of jobs. They were looking for new jobs. And so they thought if they volunteered in our organization, we'd hire them. And so they're like, well, I'm going to volunteer for a little bit and then I'm going to get hired. And so they would start to talk about some of these things. And then you'd see that that was their motivation. Well, if that's their motivation, there's nothing wrong with that. But if it's not likely that that's going to happen, you want to be honest, and that maybe this isn't the best place for you to volunteer. Or if this is really what you want to do, let's put you on that track. And then that saves you the heartache later of that person who's not following through and things like that. General attitude and emotional reactions. I have unfortunately worked with people from all different paths of life and for all kinds of different needs. And so one of them was a SANE program, which is a sexual assault nurse examiner program. And we had people who were advocates for people who, just ungodly, but had been the victims of a sexual assault. And so you would think that you would want to have like just the most perfect people being an advocate. And, you would think like if this was your best friend, if this was, your mother, whoever, and God forbid, or your child and had been a victim of that, if all the people that you put in touch with them, you want them to be good, solid people who are able to help. And I'm not saying that someone didn't have good motivations, but in this case, sometimes we would find out they themselves were experiencing tremendous trauma from their own experience. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't be good in another place, but maybe you're not ready to be an advocate now. And so you do have to use your judgment. And it doesn't mean, again, that they couldn't be someday, but right now, that might not be where they're at. So using that as a guide. So, and then their maturity and their stability. And I'm going to also say maturity and stability. Stability may also include things like, um, are they in a good place to be able to volunteer? More so than just even something as wildly traumatic as that last example. But are they in between jobs right now? It's not really trauma, but it's their stability. I mean, things are rapidly changing in their lives. We would find that, well, in a month, I'm going to start a graduate program. Well, maybe this isn't the time to launch into a volunteer role where we need you here and we need that consistency and stability. And you have to look at that as with the wider lens of the organization. Again, it doesn't mean if you have short-term things that they couldn't do, but maybe if they had their heart set on one thing, that probably might not be it. The questions that they ask, uh, like, you do want to be careful of that. There could be people that are, looking to do something you don't want them to do. And so what are their questions? Are they appropriate questions? If you do enough interviews, you know what the appropriate questions are. And so when they're not appropriate questions, You can, okay, well, tell me more about that, or like maybe we need to step back and just have a private conversation. You know, help me understand that. What are your thoughts there? Hidden agendas. And I don't mean that they're all like nefarious reasons. I just mean like hidden agendas, like they are somebody who wants to be associated with your organization because of a power dynamic or a conflict of interest. And and I don't mean that they're all horribly bad things, but they can provide, they can create problems. For example, here's a great example. In a past organization, I had a close partner, but kind of a competitor. And I don't want to mean it like that because in nonprofits, we don't really have competitors, but it was definitely a conflict of interest. And this person wanted to become a board member for our organization. Well, truthfully, she wanted to be a board member so she could exercise more professional control to help her job out. That's what I mean by a hidden agenda. And I don't mean that this person was a bad person, but really, when it came down to it, that's what it was. And it doesn't mean it's bad, but is that really something that you want on your plate to think about? And then the next thing is their confidence level. You know, is their confidence level unusually high or unusually low? A confidence level and their like how they present themselves. Sometimes it could be their they don't have the confidence level right now, like our teens. They don't have the confidence level to put them out in front in a position where they're going to fail. Start on a softer scale, a lower risk, so that they can build their skills up. On the other hand, I've had people and that they seemed highly confident, and then they were so confident that they kind of overstepped. And so, finding that middle ground and making sure that if you have somebody who you think is going to overstep like that, putting them someplace where they're not going to fail. That's the point of the interview. So, questions arising from the application or previous contact. Is someone come in and they've been rude to your staff? Have they been a problem? Um, was there a mental illness? Kind of things like that. I worked in a shelter where we had a previous client who had some mental health issues, and she was in a good place and she came back later and wanted to volunteer, and she did a lot of really great things. And then, she was doing so great. I think she kind of got off her medications and we had a huge problem. And so, you know, should we have done that? I don't know. I didn't make those decisions, but it was carefully weighed out. And in the end, they gave her a chance. My feeling would be, yeah, give her a chance and then see where things go. A lot of times it comes down to that, whether you're going to give somebody a chance, but low risk areas, they didn't put her in the media or anything like that, but they had her doing some things with gardening and, things that were like safer things for her to do where um, she could contribute and feel good about, and we could feel good about and safe about that interaction.
Melissa, someone was wondering, how do we deal with individuals that use alcohol or marijuana on a regular basis, including volunteer activities? How do we
Yeah.
speak to them about this?
So, um, I would say any alcohol consumption before your shift while you're volunteering, doing any of those duties would absolutely not be permitted. I would say being under the influence of marijuana or any other drugs, including prescription, where it would prescription that would hinder their abilities. Like you can't take a narco and go in and drive somebody around for the Davies project. We wouldn't want you doing that. Um, so think about that. Any kind of anything that would impair you, absolutely not. I think that's totally reasonable. I would look to what your organizational stance is, and I would also look to what your organizational stance is on employees, because in most cases, you can't go way more for a volunteer, but you can hold them to the same accountability standards as an employee. So I would talk with your leadership, talk with your HR, legal team, and, ask if you could have the same policy for employees as volunteers. Uh, where I was at, they did do drug testing for employees, and they even did nicotine testing. We did not do nicotine testing for volunteers, but they had to sign a thing in healthcare that they didn't use nicotine products. And so, but it was very specific about um, I don't even know if marijuana was legal then. I can't remember, but I know even like I was on a school board and we sent a thing out to all staff and teachers that even if it's legal here, it's still considered a federal thing, and that wasn't gonna be allowed. So there was this, they had a policy on it. So, but again, very vetted, and so don't make it up on your own. Does that help, I hope? And overall, if you're not comfortable verifying the basic competency to do the role that they asked for, or any role, give that some thought and think about it. And it isn't usually if you have good standards in place, you go against that. And then if you have a question like, huh, it's not really fitting in any one of these, have somebody else interview them and take a look. So I want to give you some interview safety tips. One, do not reject a person face to face. You never know. There's a reason why you're rejecting them, but unless it's something like, you're about to start your job, or, why don't you come back? Get settled in that and then come back. Or let me follow up with you in 6 weeks or something like that. But if you have to reject someone because they failed a background check, because you caught them in something, I don't know, whatever, whatever the reason is, do it over the phone. And um, generally speaking, when I was the leader of that program, I was the one who did that. And the reason why I did that when it was me that did it was because I wanted it to not have any variation. I wanted it to um, be the way that it needed to be, so that it didn't like upset somebody even more. I at one point was told by HR to send a letter. My opinion, all the letter ever did was tick people off. So when I did it, I would do it in a very humble way. I would call and I would do this little, I don't want to call it a trick, but kind of a trick, where you put that person in as much control as you can. And so I would say, hi, is, um, is, um, is Michelle there? Oh, Michelle. Oh, great. Yeah. This is Melissa from XYZ. And you submitted your volunteer application, or we met with you, or whatever. And I'm just wondering, is this a good time for you? And I thought, so is this a good time for you? That's one thing. They have the permission. And oh yeah, it's a good time. Okay. Um, do you remember submitting the application and us talking? Oh yes, I do. And then you assigned the confidentiality agreement. Do you remember, or the background check? Yes, I do. And well, we conducted the background check and this is what came up. And I'm wondering if you're aware of an incident on this day or this year. Oh, yeah, yeah, I am. Oh, well, unfortunately, it wasn't disclosed, but yeah, this is it. Sometimes they really aren't aware of it. And then that's your opportunity without confronting them. And they can say, that wasn't me. My name is Jane Smith, and there's probably a million Jane Smiths out there. Oh, okay, well, let's talk about some of these verifiers here. What color are your eyes? And and Jane says, "Well, I have brown eyes, and this person has green eyes. Well, how tall are you?" And she's like, "I'm 5'2". Well, this person is 5'10". Probably not the same person. And then you can say, "Oh, okay, okay, well, just so you know, there's something that's here that we found that I got to get cleared up. And here's how we could do it." But you're like presenting the information, you're not confronting them, you're not in any nasty way being like confrontational with them, and they're giving you permission to talk to them about this kind of consistently. But your voice is very humble and you're like, "I am so sorry that this happened." You're not saying, "I'm sorry that you may or may not have committed a crime or that you might have been misleading us." I'm not saying any of that. And I don't even feel that way. I'm just like, "I'm just sorry that this happened." And or to say, "I wish this hadn't happened." Those are non inflammatory ways to say, it's really is on you. You've got to take care of this, or this is the reason why we can't proceed. But sometimes I would have people that would know about an incident and they'd admit to the incident, but they didn't put it on the background and they thought that it meant that they thought it was gone, or whatever the reason is. I don't have any judgment on them for that. And I was like, "Oh, again, I'm just so sorry this has happened." uh According to our policy, however, it sounds bad, but it's considered like a falsification of an application. And unfortunately, because of that, I'm not able to proceed with your onboarding as a volunteer. And again, I'm really sorry. And I would say, well, but if you can take away from this that now that it's there, and the next time you want to volunteer somewhere, just talk to them about it. I would even go as far as just making a call even before you do the application and just being honest about it. Um, that might be the way it is. Or if it's something that would just, what if it was an assault? Well, a lot of people can't take an assault. And you know what? I've also had domestic violence victims that were arrested, and they were in a program that a partner said, "Well, sometimes they could have been the victim." Well, okay, they might have been the victim, but guess what? It's here, and I am not in a position to say whether they were the victim or not. It's not my role. My role is to keep the organization safe. And so this person has the opportunity, and every citizen does, to be able to go and have that removed if it's appropriate for them to have it removed. So what I tend to do is being helpful and caring about that person. If you'd like, I can give you a copy of this, and the directions to have it addressed are is located here on the iChat. Or recommend that they go to any state police, even if it's the wrong person. It's Jane Smith. There's a million Jane Smiths. This is clearly not our Jane Smith here. They can do a fingerprint check and they can get it resolved that way. And then it's pretty speedy, actually. And I've had plenty of people that happened to. And I've been so glad every time that I did that I did not go down this road of being like, "Wow, you signed up to be a volunteer, and how dare you, because you're a terrible person. Look at all these crimes." I've never done that to anyone, nor would I. But understand, you want to preserve the image they have of your organization, your own safety, and the safety of the organization. So being kind, being respectful, being humble about this, but you still, upholding the organization's safety and values, and their rules and their compliance is really important. Okay. So if you have any idea that the person has a disability, like maybe from their application, I would just call and just have a conversation with them. Not say, "Hey," but, the premise of the conversation is, "Hey, I just wanted to call and I got your application. I wanna thank you for the time that you invested in that, and why don't you, would you like to come in and, or like, what would you like to do in our organization? Oh, that sounds great. Um, and say, is there anybody else you want to bring in? Does that kind of make sense? We'll sit down, we'll talk about it. And it again just starts that thing of that relationship. Most of the time, people, when I've done that, they've been pretty upfront and they said, I think I'd like to bring, like my mom in, or I'd like to bring my caseworker. Oh, okay. And then having that conversation about, are you working with some programs? It's fine to bring a rehab coach in or something like that. Um, that just tends to start the relationship on a good foot. And I didn't put this here about safety tips because I don't think because someone has a disability, it creates a safety issue, but a safety issue of privacy and, keeping that person's dignity together and being respectful of that person, then there may be some things that they don't want to share with other people. And so, knowing that, and like if you do group interviews, I wouldn't want to have that person have to do that in front of tell something that they may not be comfortable telling, things like that. And, yeah, and I talked about job coaches. And the last one, I love job coaches, structuring it so to make it possible for that person. And we would onboard that job coach just like we would the volunteer. They'd have to get a background check, things like that, and do the trainings. And then, and I've said this already, but being honest and forthright that, we'll try it out. Let's see what happens. But being realistic and trusting your instincts. I, for example, did have a girl one time, a young lady that came in, and, you could tell she was very proud um, and she signed up. She was taking college classes. She signed up for a college interview and she came in and she obviously had a lot of challenges. And, I thought, "Uh-oh, we gotta make a quick pivot here." And so we ended up letting her just go through the interview, and we just tried to be as respectful as we could. We followed up and said, "Hey, why don't you," we had this conversation with her. It ended up, for a really strange reason, not being a safe place for her to volunteer, and it was actually her job coaches that followed up and talked to the family and said, I don't think this is the place for her. And it was because she had a thing that she liked to get things out of the trash can. But in a healthcare setting, you can never be sure what is in that trash can. And I do not mean that nurses and medical people are putting needles in there, but we were having a real problem. And I just had to be really honest with them. You can never put your hand in a trash can. You can never even put your foot in it because people do sometimes come here and they use injectable drugs and they put them in the trash can. It's our visitors. And we were having people who were unfortunately like doing heroin in public places and they put it in the bathroom. And it was just a really unsafe thing. And that's a sadder thing on society, but I was just really honest that for a one little reason why it didn't seem like it was a safe place for her to be, that was it, and her rehab staff said, "There's no way, we can't get her to not do that." And I said, "This just scares me to death that she could really get hurt that way, and if she wasn't someone who could maybe even tell us, 'Hey, this happened.'" Oh my gosh. So, just another thing, but this comes from a whole lot of experience of doing this for a number of years. So in total, your organization, every one of your organizations deserves more than just a warm body. So being loving and caring and respectful of your volunteers is huge. And then it leads to a better placement. So always give that person that time to review that position description. They can take it home and you can just check with them if that's what they need. I like to have those things available to them on the internet so they can review those. And then when they come in, I'm going to give them a paper copy of it. Like I said, if there's any reason why they can't fulfill the competencies of the position. Think about how much time that person has to serve. More time isn't always better. I think that it's a lot of times people get so excited about coming into your organization and volunteering that they're like, I want to be here 4 days a week. Well, let's be honest, most people can't be there 4 days a week. And why? It's because life happens. They've got a grandson who's got a snow day and they're going to be around, things like that. So start it out where it's manageable for them and then they could build up. Having a great training practices in place so someone could quickly go in after acceptance, after you've accepted them. And I always like when they leave the interview that they know when their training is and who they're going to train with. And then there's a follow-up of like, hey, just, a confirmation. This is who you're going to train with. This is the day. This is the time. This is where you're going to park. If something happens, this is who you're going to meet. This is who you're going to call if something happens and you can't be there. And so you're giving them as much to be comfortable about and to think about this, that it's hard for a volunteer to come in. It may not seem like it's hard, but it's hard. They get nervous about it. Just like starting a new job, did I do the right thing? They're nervous. So answer a lot of those little questions as much as possible. And if you have volunteers that have been in your organization a long time, they can kind of help you with all those little things to highlight them and to let somebody know what they are. So that's always like a great interview placement practice. So ensuring that the placement sticks. I think this is one of our most under valued aspects of our job. So uh, making sure that the motivation matches where you end up placing them. I've had people that, had great skills and they really wanted to do this one thing. And I thought, oh, there's no reason they can't do it. But I knew that it wasn't going to keep them engaged long term. And it was kind of like, oh, that's a bummer. And because they would have been great. And I knew they were going to get bored. So what did I do about it? It kind of went into that leading up at key times in the onboarding cycle. And so what we found, and we looked at data on when people tended to drop off and what made sense, we would follow up at three key times: 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and 90 days. And so by the time that 90 days came around, that one person I'm thinking of was bored, and we were able to move her before we lost her. If you don't do that, and they really want to go there, but it's like, I know that this isn't going to work out. They need other opportunities. So it gave us a chance at 90 days to re-recruit them. And it turns out we re-recruited them for another position that we were able to keep this person going. At 6 weeks, asking them for their opinion. How are things going? I mean, what ideas do you have to help us improve? And then at 2 weeks, just making sure, one, they had hours, they were working or they weren't working, what happened? How can we get things back on track? And then, now that you've done this, tell me about your training. Do you have any questions? And we would always say, do you want someone from our staff to contact you about your engagement and how well you're liking it? If there's anything you want to share with us, we're happy to talk with you. And that following up at key times on their onboarding cycle, whenever it seems to work for your organization, was a key to helping us make sure that we were able to get people and keep people on track and keep them engaged with us. And then having a specific engagement strategy. And I would really encourage you to talk with your volunteers about that. What are the reasons why they're going away? Even the ones that did go away. Why did they go away? And knowing what those are and then helping to work around those. Is it creating more flexible opportunities? And how can you do that? And how can you talk to your team about that? You know, putting the team, meaning your volunteers, your leadership, your fellow colleagues together, and really having that synergy about being committed to a volunteer strategy, I think is critically important to being able to help bring it all together. And then mentors and friends. The number one thing that people need in their lives, and it's at the heart of why people volunteer, is volunteering is like the antidote to isolation and loneliness. And if we can reach out to those people who are isolated and lonely, one, we'd have a healthier, happier world. But two, uh, helping people, you know, lots of people aren't joiners, and they tend to be, they tend to still, even if they're not joiners, they tend to experience loneliness and isolation at times. And so, how can you help your program be the antidote to that for your community? Whether it's people who aren't normally asked to volunteer, that you have a way to reach out to those people to get them involved, or how do you engage with people that, you know, maybe wouldn't normally think of this? And, you know, we have some things with our youth programs that we do that we specifically ask, hey, tell us how you're reaching out to young people that aren't usually asked. Those young people can include kids who are in foster care. Not their fault, but, you know, do they get those same opportunities as another kid might? People who, one, have a disability, two, what if English isn't a first language? Or people who are involved with the juvenile justice system or the justice system as a whole. I can tell you that I would work with, um, prior to, I would work when I was at United Way, I would work with a lot of people who had drunk drivings and different things. And, you know, sometimes they did things, they were very talented people, and they would do things for me outside, like in their home or using their skill that they had. I had a woodworker guy that would create things for kits for kids to use. And then, and then the other thing is planning for regular touch bases, having a good communication plan in place so that you are engaging with people, and then, you know, going around and talking to them about these. Hey, did you hear we're going to have our picnic? Are you going to be there? We're going to have our volunteer meeting. We're going to have our potluck. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Or this change and this policy happened. Tell me about it. Tell me how you feel about it. And let's work through it so that people aren't like stewing about these things in the back of their mind, that, you know, they're involved, and then that is making sure that they're engaged and that they feel a part of the work that's being done. So, oops. So here's some things that I'm promising I'm going to send to you. We have some sample interview questions, a sample interview form, and a sample tool to use during the onboarding period. And you can change these, you can alter these any way you want, but it's just a good general questions that may be able to help you, that look at motivations, look at availability, look at future plans, things like that. I hope that this session was helpful to you. I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to stop my share, actually. I'm going to stop my recording and ask if there are any questions. How are we doing on our